Peer Review is a series of podcasts designed to shed light on the extraordinary breadth and diversity of talent that sit in the House of Lords. The House of Lords often gets a bad rap because it is thought to be a house of cronies and it is an unelected house. But I hope through these interviews you will see that there is this extraordinary talent, there is a great knowledge and experience, and with that I leave you to draw your own conclusions. Well, my guest today is Michael Spencer, a legendary city figure. For those young people going into the city, he was an aspirational figure, and people go and, when they decide to go into work, think about becoming successful, and Michael is the embodiment of that. But not only successful in business, successful in his charitable work, and successful since he's retired in the business with so many other things. Michael, very good to see you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Where did you think the drive came from within you to build this fantastic business? Were you always born sort of really wanting to?
My father was a civil servant. He joined the colonial service after the war, but then moved not long after that to the United Nations, and I was brought up in Africa mostly, and I was very, very fond of my father, but very early in life I said, Dad, I admire what you do, but that's not what I'm going to do, and I want to go into finance, I want to work in the city, and I want to go and make some money.
So what age was that?
I was 15 when I had that conversation, which was a little bit alarming, perhaps you might say.
But it all started, you were born in Kuala Lumpur, of course. Your father was working as a civil servant there, wasn't he?
Yes, he was a colonial civil servant in the last colonial administration of Malaya.
And he enjoyed it out there?
Yes, I think it was the high point of his career, to be honest with you. He had been there since, I think, 1949 or 1950 when he joined. Malaya got independence in 1957. Tunku Abdul Rahman was the first Prime Minister of independent Malaya. My father's very close to him, had helped advise him on his campaign and his economic policy. And my father stayed on for a few years in Malaya, but in 1960 joined UN and was posted to Khartoum.
Which is where you spent early days?
Yes, I remember Malaya a bit, but I remember Khartoum very, very well. When we lived there in 1960 to 64, I remember it very, very fondly. I learned, sadly, long since forgotten, I spoke Arabic quite well as a young boy, and it was a small city with one traffic light and a very small expatriate community, but a very wonderful feeling. The Sudanese are very, very, very friendly people.
Yeah, and what was your father doing there?
He was economic advisor to the newly independent. Sudan had become independent in 1957 rather hurriedly after the catastrophic Suez War, and he was a foreign advisor to advise Sudan on their international financial relations.
And like many colonial children, you were sent to school in the United Kingdom? I
was, yes, at the age of 8, having been brought up in Khartoum where the weather was quite warm. All the time I was sent to England in 1963, arriving in a cold, damp, grey, autumnal morning, wondering why anyone would want to. I'd barely visited England by that stage. I think I'd only visited it once or maybe twice. Wonder why anyone would want to live in this grey, wet country.
But miserable in other ways because, you didn't have a family. Your parents were abroad, so you were exeats or half-term. Presumably you didn't go home. You went to grandparents or something like that?
No, sadly, none of my grandparents were alive, actually, and by then they'd all gone, very sadly, and we didn't have any relations in the UK, but, life was different then, so you just knuckled down and got on with life.
And you went to Worth, which was a Catholic school run by monks, largely, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, my father was a devout Catholic and was very keen that I should be educated, and my sister as well, at a Catholic school, and we were sent to Worth, which was then quite a relatively small school, but actually overall did a very good job for me in the time I was there.
Yeah, and you found your way up to university?
I did.
You got a scholarship, didn't you?
Yes.
You must be clever.
I got a scholarship to read physics at Oxford, and I went up to my college, Corpus Christi, in 1973. I only got a 2-2, of course, embarrassment for me, but never mind. Didn't seem to impede my career. I've said afterwards, you don't want to peak too early in life.
So you went to Corpus then, and how did you get into the city? Having decided you were going at 15, you were going to be this sort of big star in the city. How did you actually get there, given your father probably didn't have a lot of contacts in the city?
He didn't at all. But at least I knew what I wanted to do. I mean, most of my contemporaries graduating from Oxford in that period, the vast majority didn't really know what they wanted to do. They didn't know if they wanted to do the civil service exams or work for Procter & Gamble or Unilever or Shell or, a bank of some kind. Most of them really hadn't a clue, but at least I knew what I wanted to do. And embarrassing that sounds, I used to read the FT during my undergraduate... I know, a little bit too keen, perhaps. So I used to read the FT, and I got interviewed by a few organisations, and I got a job with a stockbroking firm. Of course, post Big Bang doesn't exist anymore. Of course, Simon & Coates, a nice firm as it happens.
And that was in 76?
76, I joined the stock market, went down September 76, moved to London, which I knew, but I didn't know intimately, and started working in the city. And
what actually did you do? What was the daily chore when you first started in the city?
My allotted task for Simon & Coates was to be a trainee investment analyst. So that is, I was supposed to do research on various companies and come out with an investment recommendation on them, whether they were a good stock to buy or a good stock not to buy. And I enjoyed that, actually. And I love the buzz of the stock market. There's something exhilarating. I mean, in 1976, it was still a fairly difficult time in financial services. The UK economy at that stage, you will recall, all of that generation will recall, was in dire straits after many years of socialist misrule. We'd had the winter of discontent, the 3-day week. It was pretty grim, but nevertheless, you sort of got on with life, and there was nothing more exhilarating than going down the floor of the stock market on a busy day.
And you were at Simon & Coates for 4 or 5 years and then joined Drexel's.
I was at Simon & Coates 4 or 5 years. Of course, you've forgotten the sentinel moment in the financial world. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, and her first act, pretty much in economic terms, on becoming Prime Minister, was the abolition of exchange control, which everybody thought. It's difficult to imagine now that we had exchange control in our lifetime. And as you will recall, in those days, you were only allowed to take £50, which is stamped in your passport if you were going overseas. The abolition of exchange control was a sentinel and signal event of how Thatcher was going to treat financial services, the financial world, in a more contemporary fashion. And yes, although I enjoyed the stock market very much, I moved to Drexel, an American firm,
who had quite a spivvy reputation, Drexel's, in those days.
No,
ended up.
No, I don't actually think that's fair. I thought Drexel was actually, for me, an illumination as a firm to work for. The British firms, stockbroking firms particularly, were generally sort of interested in who your family was, where you went to school more than where you went to university, interestingly, who you knew. Drexel really didn't care who your family were, where you went to school, mildly interested in your university. They were really interested in whether you had the nous, you had the drive, you had the energy to really make money. And I learned a huge amount for working for Drexel. And actually, when I worked there, I was a very, very small cog, in fairness, in a pretty big machine headquartered in Broad Street in New York. But it wasn't considered a spivvy firm. It was considered an aggressive firm, an entrepreneurial firm. It was only subsequently, I think, its reputation got unfairly sullied by its involvement in high-yield bonds.
Mm. And there was another job in between, but in 86, you started on your own.
Well, after Drexel, I went to work for a sort of London money-broking firm called Charles Fulton, late and unlamented, where I set up an interest rate derivative business for them.
And what is interest rate derivatives?
It was really at the revolutionary cutting edge of the financial market then. We had the creation of the futures markets in London, the Life, as it was then called, which was trading interest rate futures. There were big futures exchanges in Chicago.
So what is an interest rate future?
It's a marketplace in long-term interest rates, and it is called an interest rate swap, where one party pays a fixed rate of interest on a nominal amount for a period of time, and the other party pays a floating rate of interest over that same period, and no principal exchange. Is exchange. It's an exchange of interest rates.
So you're kind of betting on the interest rate future.
The reality is the design of this wasn't designed particularly for betting. It was designed for people who had issued bonds, and you could choose using an interest rate derivative if and when you wanted to swap that bond from a fixed rate interest payment to you to a floating rate interest. It suddenly gave a degree of flexibility about interest rate risk management that simply didn't exist before.
And at that point, the interest rates had settled down a bit. They were still pretty high in the UK.
Very high, yeah.
We'd come out of the winter of discontent, as you mentioned earlier. Big bang had happened, but we were still paying pretty high interest on our mortgage, much higher than we are now.
Yeah, 12 or 13%, I think, in my
but
my
it
memory.
had sort of started to settle down. It had peaked, I think, in 86, really. And, that expertise, presumably, you took with you to start ICAP, as it was then called.
Yes, I mean, the desk I ran at Charles Fulton was a very small desk, 4 of us. It was quite a mathematical marketplace. My physics degree helped me to a degree in that. I could program a handheld calculator and a handheld computer. And the desk was very successful. We did a lot of business with many big banks in London. Fulton went public in 1985. I did quite well out of that. And in 1986, I thought, I'm going to realise one of my long-term ambitions, which was to set up my own business. So in May the 1st, 1986, we set up ICAP.
You were 31.
I was 30 actually at the time, but no, 31 a few weeks later.
And was your father still alive to witness?
Yeah, he was actually.
Witness the sort of fulfilment of your 15-year-old ambition.
He was still alive, yes, and he was very proud.
Tell us a bit about ICAP. I mean, you talked about interest rates and things like that, but what else did ICAP do?
In the early days, we were absolutely and exclusively a London-based specialist in interest rate derivatives. And we either, you could call it judgment or luck, we chose a very, very high value area of the market, a very technical area of the market, which I think gave me, our firm, a competitive advantage. And it was a business that was growing very, very rapidly. And it developed really initially in US dollars, but moved to sterling, Deutschmarks. This is before euro, of course. Yeah. And we, ICAP, unusually, I started it with £50,000. In those days, regulatory red tape about starting businesses was all but non-existent compared with the absurd extremes we've gone to now. We needed no regulatory approval, no capital adequacy, and literally started the business, 4 members of staff, £50,000. We made a profit in our first month, and thereafter never lost money in any month that I can recall. And indeed, in our entire time, from founding the firm in 1986 until we went public in 98, or became a FTSE 100 company 20 years later in 2006, we never raised one more penny of cash. So it was quite an interesting journey.
And you broadened the base of it, but technology and the march forward of technology you were the first to embrace. And ultimately it became the platform for trading, didn't it, through a technological platform?
Yes, I mean, the journey was a little bit more, I think, worth touching on briefly.
Yeah.
You know, when we started in 86, there were 23 other firms, money-broking firms, as we called them then, in London, and many of them doing exactly what we were doing, exactly with the same clients, and really we were just a Me Too firm, only the new boy on the block and only 4 staff. And we built on the profitability and the success of that business to expand it significantly to the point where we became the dominant interest rate derivative broker in London, not just dealing in interest rate derivatives, but also dealing in options on interest rate derivatives, an even more technical aspect of the game. It was all dealt with in the professional marketplace. We had no private clients. Our clients were, the Deutsche Banks, JP Morgans, Barclays, Goldman Sachs's of this world, and many, obviously, banks outside of London, in Frankfurt, Paris, Geneva, and elsewhere. It was a very international business. It was very lucrative. And on the back of that, we expanded in 1990 into commodity and energy derivatives, and we were an innovative leader in that as well, which fortunately turned out very well.
And just explain what an energy derivative is.
Again, we've all know, the price of oil might be $100 or $80. Energy derivatives are what is an energy swap is a payment of differences around the long-term price of energy. So
you
it's a bit
even out your price. So you're a buyer.
If you're in a long-term contract to, let's say you're an aviation, an airline, and you're buying, X amounts of aviation fuel a month to keep your planes in the air, using a jet fuel swap, you could either buy your cost on that could be variable to the monthly cost of jet fuel, or a fixed price over the next 5 years.
Yeah.
So you as an airline
could make evening out the variations on the oil price.
You could work out if you wanted to fix your risk and buy your fuel on a fixed price basis or a floating price basis, or indeed switch between the two using energy derivatives. And then we moved into other markets as well. We moved into the foreign exchange market, which is a big market, bond markets, and in 98, when we were still a private company, albeit that by then we were a very powerful force in the London market. We did a reverse takeover of a big in numbers but not in value listed company called Exco, which had formerly been a dominant player in London, but I'm afraid years of mismanagement had left it with a big global presence, 1,500 staff, but its market cap was a very modest.
So you took
that
private?
No, we didn't. We did a reverse takeover, so it remained a listed company.
Yeah.
50% of the equity came to us, and suddenly Exco, instead of being Exco, became ICAP, and so we became listed in 98. And it was our big leap forward. Exco had a big operation in New York, which we didn't, old ICAP didn't have, and in Asia, in Singapore.
So it made gave you global offices.
Suddenly we'd become global.
And in 2006, of course, you went into the FTSE 100, which is...
there were some more issues between going public in 98 through Exco, which turned out a very big success, and we took out huge costs of that. They had a huge middle layer of managers who were not productive, and we took nearly 50% of the staff out of the business, some 800 people, and the revenue didn't change at all. Our share price, I'm pleased to say, went up considerably, and then we did another merger a year later with Garban, a very good London-listed company. Yep. But who had an outstanding business in America. So suddenly from 97, when we'd gone from being a boutique, a very, very profitable, but boutique London broking firm, by the end of 99, we were the biggest broking firm in the world by a good margin. We then faced our first, what I would call major crisis. Well, certainly the biggest crisis of my career, and I hope I don't have to repeat anything like it. In the States, we had 3 floors in the World Trade Center.
Yes.
And so that was an
And did you lose a lot of staff?
Well, we didn't, no. We were fortunately in the lower floors of the World Trade Center. We were in floor 25 and 6 of the first tower that was hit, 55 on the second tower, and fortunately, with all 700 of our staff, with the sad exception of one very sad, poor, unfortunate lady who was on the top floor of the first tower going to a conference, all of our staff were out, and many of them traumatized, by the way. It was a pretty frightening time. Yeah. But nevertheless, they survived. Although at the time, it felt like, to me, in London then, almost an existential moment to lose, your entire American business in one go, And
of course, all the computers and all the systems. And
oh, I'm afraid to say our backups were in each other's office. We never thought both towers would go down. But nevertheless, we did recover from that. I mean, it was an extraordinary period, but we did recover. And I would say within a year, you wouldn't have known that we'd been through such an existential crisis. And as you said, then there are a couple of other things that happened. We bought some big electronic assets, which was very important to us. In 2003, Brokertech, and in 2006, a foreign exchange platform called EBS. And indeed, in 2006, we went into the FTSE 100, which, given it was 20 years after we started, was great. Good journey.
Yeah, and became one of the biggest businesses in the United Kingdom. I mean, you mentioned one mishap. There was, in 2013, of course, the LIBOR issue, which your firm, like every firm, had its share of involvement. I think largely innocently from your own perspective, but obviously you had a couple of members of staff who were heavily criticised by the authorities.
Yes, it was obviously a terrible period. The financial crisis had regulators running around desperately to find culprits, politicians likewise, and the press also. And there was a lot of drama about a fixing of interest rates on LIBOR, as you will recall, a very big issue. We sadly got fined in relationship from that by the regulators in the UK and the US. A few years later, by the way, our three staff responsible for the fine all three of them were prosecuted in the UK, and all three of them were found innocent by the entirety of the jury. And I personally thought at the time, and that our fines were totally unreasonable. And there is no question, of course, had those trials taken place before the regulator extracted money from us, they would not have been able to do so. But it was a very, very unhappy and very, very stressful episode.
Yeah, and of course, you personally weren't implicated in any shape or form, but it must have been a really difficult time. And it brings on to the question, and you mentioned it earlier in the thing about this regulation and regulatory system that we now have that throw a lot of aspersion over people and then often have failed to press their case. I mean, you've seen firsthand, more than anybody, how regulation has changed. What's your take on it at the moment? And how do we roll back from it if your take is not a good one?
Well, I've nothing against proper regulation, by the way. I mean, I'm not against let's rephrase that. I'm totally in favour of a properly constructed regulatory framework that is well led, well managed, well implemented, well executed. Unfortunate, and that is proportionate. I mean, if you over-regulate everything, you can strangle it. And I think to an extent we have gone far too far in terms of our regulation in financial services. And I think there is material and damaging overkill that is stifling innovation and stifling businesses. And I reflect that the regulators are all too often seeking. They're not seeking to be helpful. They see themselves all too often as adversaries in uniforms. And I think that is damaging. I think the regulators should have, as part of their remit, an interest in making London a better, more successful, more efficient, and more globally competitive financial centre, rather than just rushing around being very aggressive to everybody and anybody.
Looking back, would you be a director of a public company now? Would you want to put yourself through all this the regulations, and would you consider it a stifle to doing it again?
I was chief executive of a public company for 20 years and had a very lucky career, and I enjoyed it enormously. But towards the end, I found it very tiresome. The endless level of regulatory burden on things like excessive pressure on issues like diversity, in my opinion. And as somebody, as you know, our report and accounts got thicker and thicker every year, not really sharing financial information, merely covering issues of what governments wanted us to show that they were doing.
Yeah, very interesting. Of course, one of the things, the great achievements of ICAP was your charity day.
Yes, this is something which I'm very pleased we started in 1993 when the firm was very, very, very much smaller, of course, than it was in the latter years. We started out an idea where one day a year, or nearly always in December, period of seasonal goodwill and all that, we would give our entire revenue from our day's broking activities to charity. It was an innovative idea at the time. It's since been copied by many others. I think that's a sincerest form of flattery. In our first year, I think we raised, my recollection is we raised £250,000. We were absolutely astonished, utterly thrilled. Our clients loved us for doing it. The staff enjoyed being part of it. The charities were astonished. And we've continued that every year since then. And I'm not involved in the company anymore, so obviously.
But it's millions now.
Oh, yeah. It's well over 150 million that the ICAP Charity Day has generated and given to charities, not just in the UK, but around the world. I mean, several thousand charities.
Amazing.
And still ongoing, I'm proud to say.
Amazing. And, of course, the other thing we mustn't overlook is politics. And I remember sitting you down after I'd been treasurer of the Conservative Party for 3 months and saying, it's about time you come and take over. And you said, come and talk to me in about 3 years. So I had to sit it out for 3 years, and you very decently took over from me. And an exciting time, actually, because Cameron was our leader, and it was pretty close to his election.
Yes, I mean, I took over from you in, actually, it wasn't that close to his election. You handed the baton to me, if I recall correctly, in January 2000.
As I possibly could.
In January 2007. And I had confidence in Cameron. I was proud to work for him, proud to serve him, and I liked George Osborne as well, and I thought they had a very good team around them. At the time, most people thought they had very little chance of winning the election. Tony Blair was still Prime Minister then, but obviously he moved on to be replaced by Gordon Brown, and indeed in 2010, Cameron won what the party did. He became Prime Minister, and I was very proud that over 3 years I was able to raise, with the help of many very other talented, capable people, the money to fund a proper election campaign. And I look back on that with very happy memories.
Yeah, and you were very successful at it, like unfortunately everything you've done. The circle, of course, has now come all the way around in that you're spending a lot of time in Africa. You've got a house in Kenya. You're very interested in wildlife conservation there. That must be a sort of, tick in the box. I'm back to an area of the world where I have great love for.
Yes, having been brought up in Africa, Khartoum, 1960 to 64, Addis Ababa, 64 to 77, Africa got into my system, got into my blood. And in 2010, my wife and I built a house in Kenya. It's given us huge pleasure and huge satisfaction in northern Kenya and Laikipia. It's a wonderful wildlife conservancy. We now have 65 rhinos there. Amazing, really. Large numbers of elephant, buffalo, lions, leopards. And we get huge pleasure, but it's a great privilege to be part of, on the Barana Ranch, such an exciting and successful and, world-leading in many ways, conservation project.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. I know that you are still fully engaged in various businesses, and it's very good that we could get you here for a few moments in between all your meetings. I think you're fully engaged largely in private businesses, I think it's fair to say. But it's been great, and thank you so much for sparing the time.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to see you too.